I've been on the carnivore diet for well over a year now, and after experimenting with many different foods, there are 5 that I've stopped eating completely. So in this video, I'll share with you what these 5 foods are and why I've stopped eating them. Some of these foods caused me acne breakouts, some of them gave me low energy, and some I stopped consuming simply because I realized that they were terrible. So let's get into it. Food number 1. A couple of months back, I was away visiting some family. When I arrived at their house, my grandfather, being the great man that he is, said, "Max, I know you love your steaks, so I got you some." So he gets them out, puts them on the table, and I sat there and looked at them. I could clearly see that one was a beef steak, but the other meat, I hadn't seen it before. It looked a lot like beef, it was a similar colour, but it just looked slightly different. So I turned to him, I was like, "What is this meat right here? I've never seen this before in my life." And he goes, "It's pork. My mate shot it." Now I've seen pork thousands of times in my life. Every time I go to the supermarket, I see it. But it never looked like this stuff. Pork is usually a white meat, but this wild pork, it was basically the same colour as beef. This right here is the problem with pork nowadays. What they're fed is these terrible grains. Because what they're fed is so void of nutrients, the pigs are unable to get enough nutrients to complete a process known as myoglobin synthesis, which then creates myoglobin, which is what is responsible for a red colouring in many animals. Now, aesthetic appeal isn't the only problem with feeding pigs these grains. Their meat also contains a lot less nutrients, and it's actually more inflammatory, in particular the fat. When we analyse the fat of these animals, it's very high in the inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids that we don't want to be consuming, such as linoleic acid. Now, I always knew that wild pork was better, but when I saw it with my own eyes, it made me realise just how nutrient void this stuff is. So I figured if I'm going to be eating meat that isn't super high in nutrients, I'm simply just not going to be feeling my best. So for that reason, I now avoid pork. I mean, it's still a lot better than any standard American diet food or any vegetable for that matter. But in order to feel my absolute best, I think I'm going to give pork a miss from now on. Unless I can get a good quality wild source, but I mean, that's pretty tough to find. Now this next food I make sure to avoid because it gives me a lot more noticeable effects than pork does. When I first started carnivore, I'd get the occasional acne breakout. This was rather annoying. 1, it made me not look good, but the true problem lies in the fact that your skin is essentially just your gut turned inside out. If you have a healthy gut, you'll have great skin. If you have an unhealthy gut, you'll have poor skin. So I realized something was causing me inflammation. At the time, I was literally only eating beef, eggs, and milk. So I figured the most likely culprit would be the milk. The logical next step was to cut the milk, so that's what I did. And what do you know? The acne went away. Then about a month later, I had some milk again, and the acne came back. Now the problem with the milk I was consuming is that I just got it from my local shop. So it was pasteurized. Pasteurization is a process where they heat milk to high temperatures. They do this so they can kill the bacteria, and it allows it to stay shelf stable for a lot longer. It takes a lot longer to expire. However, when they heat it to these high temperatures, it actually denatures some of the proteins. This messes with the structure of the proteins, and parts of it that are not usually visible now become visible. The human body's not used to seeing this. It sees it as a foreign threat, and as a result, you get an inflammatory response. Now, if I could easily source raw milk, I could probably drink that and be completely fine. But for me personally, I just simply have to avoid pasteurized milk if I don't want acne breakouts. So, for that reason, I make sure to avoid pasteurized milk. The next carnivore food I try to avoid is venison or just lean meats in general. Whenever I have lean cuts of meat, such as venison, I just never feel my best. I can get around it by adding heaps of butter, but again, butter is also pasteurized. So if I start consuming a lot of butter, I'll probably have the acne breakouts again. In my opinion right here, this is probably the #1 mistake that I see people making on carnivore. When you're not eating carbohydrates, fat becomes your fuel source. If you don't eat enough fat, you're not going to be able to fuel yourself, you're going to have low energy, you're going to feel terrible, you're not going to have that laser carnivore focus. Just as a whole, you're not going to be your optimal self. What a lot of people forget about fat is that they're also responsible for building our hormones. So if you don't eat enough fat, your entire hormone profile's just going to be completely out of whack. This can lead to a number of mood issues, it can contribute to low energy. Everyone their whole life has been told that fat is terrible for them. So when you say to these people, you need to eat a lot of fat, they'll add the tiniest amount, but they think it's a lot because they've never eaten fat before. I think as best practice, you want to be getting at least 1 gram of fat to 1 gram of protein. For people trying to optimize how they feel, that is the minimum amount of fat. So think about it like this. You head to the supermarket and you buy a steak. In 100 grams of muscle meat, there is 20 grams of protein. So for every 100 grams of muscle meat you're having, you need to have at least 20 grams of fat. Otherwise, you just simply won't feel your best. So nowadays, instead of having venison or some other lean cut of meat, I typically opt for beef or lamb, but it's typically usually beef because I think it just tastes ever so slightly better. It's nice having lamb once in a while, but I don't think there is a better food on the planet than beef. Especially if you chuck some eggs with it, have the egg yolk as a sauce. Literally cannot be beaten. Anyways, what was my next food? Yep, got a list. I'm organized, what can I say? That's right, got it. So with my leaner cuts of meat, I decided I was going to add some fats to it. So I figured, you know what? Cheese, that stuff tastes pretty good. So I put a bit of cheese on my meal. But then come my next meal, I was like, you know what? A bit of cheese sounds good. And then the next day, I was like, you know what? A bit of cheese sounds good. I was almost borderline getting addicted to cheese. So I figured it was in my best interest to stop eating it. The reason cheese is addictive is because it has a compound in it known as beta-casein 7. This compound quite literally acts like an opioid in our brain. It has a very similar structure to morphine, hence the similarity in names. Morphine, beta-casein, morphin. Another reason it's addictive is because it just tastes so good. When you eat something tasty, your brain releases a lot of a hormone known as dopamine. When dopamine's released, we feel a tremendous sense of pleasure. Essentially, how the human psyche works, Human Psychology 101, at all times we are either trying to seek pleasure or avoid pain. So the brain knows it can just eat this tasty thing, get its dopamine release, and you'll feel a great sense of pleasure. Which is exactly why when you start eating certain foods, you get cravings. Now when you stop consuming something for 1 to 2 weeks, your brain completely forgets how much dopamine it got from it, and you stop craving it. But if you're consuming something on a regular basis, that right there is why cravings persist. The reason I don't want to be consuming cheese every day is 1, because it's also pasteurized, so again, the skin stuff, but also because cheese is very high in energy, but it doesn't fill you up very much. On Carnivore, we eat till we're full. So if we're consuming this food that's high in energy and doesn't fill us up, we're going to consume a lot of total energy. And remember, fat is simply stored energy. The less energy you consume, the more body fat you'll tap into and the leaner you'll get. So because I want to stay in good shape, I didn't think it was in my best interest to be consuming cheese on a regular basis. And because the stuff's at least somewhat addicting, it had to go. So food number 4, cheese, gone. The final carnivore food I no longer consume is going to be a very controversial one. I'm sure there's going to be quite a few of you disagreeing with me, but anyway, this is my opinion, and that food is organ meat. In particular, I'm talking about liver. A lot of people call liver the greatest food on the planet, and yes, I mean, it is the most nutrient-dense food on the planet, but it does have a couple of problems. For one, it's very high in vitamin A. If you just have 100 grams of beef liver, which isn't very much at all, you are having 5 times the RDA for vitamin A. Now, vitamin A is fat soluble, so if you consume excess amounts of it, it's stored in the liver rather than excreted, which then leads to vitamin A toxicity, which usually results in some electrolyte issues. In fact, many people speculate this is why Paul Saladino had to quit the carnivore diet. He consumed a lot of liver, and he has his own liver supplement company. So what he found after being on carnivore for a while is that he was having trouble sleeping, having heart palpitations, as well as muscle cramps. And all of these symptoms are classic of any electrolyte imbalance, which, as I said, is what often occurs with vitamin A toxicity. Now, beef liver is very rich in copper. 100 grams puts you 16 times over the RDA. The problem with too much copper is it can lead to copper toxicity, which is a very serious thing. If left untreated, you can get like liver failure, brain damage. I'm sure that's a very extreme example. I've never heard of anyone getting that, but in theory, it can happen. It also messes with your copper and zinc balance, which then messes with your enzyme and cellular function. So consuming too much beef liver can definitely lead to some problems. If you're going to have a small, tiny amount, maybe like an ounce every, 2 or 3 days, I'm sure you'll be fine. But for me personally, I just don't think I need it. Also, when I eat it, it doesn't taste very good, which is essentially my body saying, hey, we don't want this stuff. So I listen to that. I don't have beef liver. Instead, I basically exclusively eat beef and eggs, the 2 greatest foods on the planet. Also, I do want to say that just because I don't eat these foods, it doesn't make them bad. Like I said earlier, these foods are still great. Much better than any vegetables, any processed food. But in order for me personally to feel and look my best, I just want to avoid these. Anyways, I think that's all I've got to say today. Good news for everyone watching, getting a haircut tomorrow, so I'm going to look a lot less like a bogan. But yeah, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. See you next time.